Hello and good tidings to you. I hope you've been enjoying a terrific week. I want to get straight into our guest today because he's a man with a whole lot to say. As lead singer for Canadian rock and roll superstars The Guess Who, Burton Cummings is a rare artist who transcends time, genres and generations with a body of work that continues to resonate with fans of all ages. Burton's voice has been rated amongst the finest in rock music, and today he continues at the top of his game as a performer, singer, songwriter, poet, and recording artist. Shall we meet him? Let's do it.
Hello, you're Sandy.
Yes, Burton, how lovely to meet you. What an amazing life story you have to tell.
Well, I'm one of the lucky ones. I've been on the radio now for over 50 years, and not everyone gets that in their career. The luckiest thing I can think of is that these songs have never gone away. And with a lot of people, they'll have maybe one or two or three very successful songs, and they'll last a few years, and then you never hear them again. I'm still hearing my voice on the radio all the time. The first big one, These Eyes, was 1968. So that's way over 50 years. I have never taken it lightly.
What do you think to yourself when you hear yourself on the radio 50 years later?
I think back to when I was in my first band. We had big dreams, but I wouldn't have foreseen myself when I was 18, 19 years old. I didn't foresee myself still out in front of thousands of people at age 75.
Can we rewind back to those early days and take us for a walk through your life coming back up to present day? Because I know that you were born and raised in Winnipeg and you dropped out of school at age 17 wanting to be a musician. Who were you so influenced by that you were so certain that that's all you wanted to do?
Well, I kind of weaseled my way into a band that was being formed by my best friend in high school. I had learned a few things, a couple of Richie Valens songs and Walk Right In by the Rooftop Singers. And I learned all these chords on piano so I could tell the guys the chords. And we ended up learning a few songs that day. And before too long, I was in the band and I was the lead singer and I was basically arranging the music. We played for a long time for nothing. We played for months before we ever got paid. So it was not a luxurious life at all. You know, the Beatles were around and that influenced everybody. So we just thought, okay, we're going to set our sights as high as we can. And that's what we did.
So you'd been tinkering around on the piano. How did you know you actually had a good voice?
I didn't really, but I had sung in the church choir for 2 or 3 years. And when I was in grade 10, they had an audition for Trial by Jury, the Gilbert and Sullivan operetta, and I got the lead tenor role. The following year, went and auditioned for HNS Pinafore. Once more, I got the lead role. But I was still glued to the radio. I was listening to Elvis Presley and Fats Domino and Jerry Lee Lewis and Little Richard. Fats and Jerry Lee and Little Richard were piano players that pounded the hell out of the keyboard. And they were my idol. I liked the piano players that sang. So from a very early age, I was hooked on records.
Were you self-taught on the piano or did you actually have formal lessons?
Oh, no, I had lessons. My mother started me on piano lessons when I was about 5 or 6.
Wow.
So I learned the mathematics of music from the Royal Conservatory courses in Canada. But I didn't ever want to end up playing music that had been written 100 years ago. I wanted to be like the Beatles. And even before the Beatles, I always loved the good singers, the Temptations, Smokey Robinson. So I was, I guess you would call, a student of pop music.
Were you ever going to be anything else after school, or all your teenage life you knew you wanted to make music your profession?
Well, I was a fairly good photographer. I got myself a really good Nikon camera when I was a teenager. And I thought I had a bit of a gift for that. But everybody that gets a good camera thinks they have a gift for photography. I probably would have ended up being a writer for possibly for a newspaper. I have one book of poetry released already. The second book of poetry is in production right now. And so I've always had a penchant for writing, for creating, but there's nothing like being in front of a crowd and getting applause. There's no feeling like that in the world. So I think I chose what I really wanted to do.
Can you describe that feeling? Give us a sense of what that's like?
It's hard to describe, but I would liken it to being plugged into a socket in the wall. There's definitely an energy that you feel coming at you from the crowd. And to me, it doesn't matter if it's 20,000 or 2,000 or 400 people. It's all the same. Once there's 10 people, it doesn't change. To me, it's what you put out on stage. That's really why I'm up there.
So does that feeling become addictive?
Very much. Very much so. And the 2 year layoff for COVID was terrible. Not only was there no work, but you can't lay around for a couple of years and then get up and start hitting your notes as if nothing has changed. If you've never been on a stage in front of several thousand people, all cheering for you directly, it's very hard to describe. But I wouldn't trade it for anything, honestly.
I bet you wouldn't. Just stepping back again, you mentioned the band you were in as a teenager. I know that you just turned 18 when you were with Chad Allen and the Expressions. Is that the band you referred to earlier?
No, I was in a band called the Devrons before I ever was phoned by the Guess Who. The Guess Who called me before my 18th birthday, and they were already the biggest band in Canada. So it was a bit of a Cinderella story for me to go from being, we were a pretty good local band, the Devrons. These guys in the Guess Who, they were cutting records. They had toured with Dion DiMucci. They had toured with the Turtles. They had played with people like Dionne Warwick, and they toured with the Kingsmen that did Louie Louie. I mean, these were legendary things to me as a little kid in Winnipeg. And then I was going to be joining this band that had actually played all over the United States. So it was a pretty big deal for me. And it was very overwhelming the morning I got that phone call, because I wasn't prepared for anything like that.
They weren't called the Guess Who at that time, were they? They were Chad Allen and the Expressions.
Yes, they were. They were. They were in the process of changing the name. They were originally Chad Allen and the Expressions, and then what happened in New York City? Scepter Records, their label, they released "Shaken All Over." Now, this was in 1965, at the height of the British music invasion, right? The height of Beatlemania days. So Scepter Records thought they would try a promotion gimmick. They just put the record out. It didn't say Chad Allen and the Expressions. It didn't say anything. It said "Shaken All Over, Guess Who?" with a question mark. And oddly enough, I guess the publicity gimmick worked because the record was a hit record. It zoomed up the charts in Billboard. And the manager at the time thought, well, let's just change the name of the group to The Guess Who. And that's how it happened. It was a fluke, and it was a promotion gimmick that once the record took off, they decided to keep that name.
So you're playing with the Devrons, you're singing out front of them, and all of a sudden one day you get a call from someone in the Guess Who, which, as you said, is a huge band already in Canada. What happens? How did you react?
I wasn't quite ready for that. I wasn't quite emotionally prepared. They wanted me to come down to their manager's office, who had an office at the local television station. And I was assuming this was to help the Devrons out, get a recording career going. So I went down there, of course, with my hopes very high. I wasn't ready for what they asked me. When I walked into the office, they asked me if I would like to join their band. I was 17 years old, and I was a bit cocky. I pulled a joke on them. I said, yeah, you know what, guys? I'd love to, but the Beatles phoned me last week, so I'll see you later. and I left the room. And I let about 30 seconds go by. And then I went back in and I said, "Are you guys actually serious? Are you asking me to join your band?" And yeah, from there it happened. And Chad Allen was still there as the lead singer, but he left a couple months later. So all of a sudden, I'm freshly turned 18 and I'm the front man for the Guess Who are known all over Canada.
Were the Deverons mad at you?
Yes, I think it was a tough thing because, we were all school buddies with big dreams. When I left, they basically folded, and the fan club was furious with me because they had a very sophisticated fan club. It would be hard for you to imagine, but Winnipeg was the rock and roll capital of Canada at that time. There were 100 bands working every weekend.
Really?
We're only talking about 380,000 people, maybe 400,000 people, to have 100 bands working. And I was part of that scene. And when they found out Chad Allen wanted to go back to university, they started looking around. Oh, who can we get? Because they didn't want to quit. So I was just in the right place at the right time. I filled the bill for what they needed. It's like a Cinderella thing. It really is. But now, before I go any further,
Yeah.
let me say this. It wasn't all roses after I joined.
Hang on a minute, you've just joined Canada's most famous band. You're 18 years old and all your dreams have come true. What could possibly be wrong? It was 1968 and the Guess Who were on the precipice to score an unprecedented string of international hit singles and albums, including American Woman, These Eyes, No Time, No Sugar Tonight, Clap for the Wolfman, Albert Flasher and many others, all either written or co-written by Burton Cummings. By 1970, the Guess Who had sold more records than the entire Canadian music industry combined. So what could have been the issue, Burton?
66 was brutally hard. We were doing 4 hours a night, and I was doing all the singing. 1 hour on, 10 minutes off, 1 hour on, 10 minutes off. That summer, we played 60 shows in 2 months. 67, we went to England to try and make it through the back door. That was brutally unsuccessful. 68, by then we were doing weekly television. But that's what saved the band. But we had tough years before These Eyes. And then when These Eyes hit, everything changed. It was our first gold record. We had about 11 or 12 singles before These Eyes, all of which bombed miserably. And then These Eyes took off and everything changed and our lives were different after that.
I think you're being very humble, though, when you said you were in the right place at the right time. And if there were more than 100 working bands there in Winnipeg and so many more through Canada, they must have selected you very carefully. They saw the talent.
Well, a very special thing happened about 4 months before that magic phone call. Jerry and the Pacemakers came to Winnipeg, our hometown. It was a hockey arena. It was sold out right to the rafters. So the Deverons got to open the show. Then it was the Guess Who with Chad Allen. And then it was Jerry and the Pacemakers. So Randy and the other guys in the Guess Who, they were there that night and they watched us because we went on before them, the Deverons. And I guess I must have been pretty good, or I must have done something that they liked because they basically said they made their decision that night.
Yeah,
and
right.
This was in August. I never got that phone call till December. They watched how I performed in front of the huge crowd and how I sang and how I kind of was the band leader. And they thought, okay, that's the guy for us.
Were you writing for the band?
Yes, once I joined the Guess Who, I was writing with Randy. Randy thought I was a bit of a songwriter and he helped me out a little bit. And then we started hanging out together, showing each other pieces. We each would write unfinished songs, but bring the pieces together. And that's how These Eyes happened. And that's how Laughing happened. We had pieces and we would meet at my place. I hadn't even left home yet. I was still living at home with my mother and grandmother. This is how young I was. And Randy would come over with his guitar. We would sit at my mother's piano and trade pieces. And hopefully After a couple of hours, there would be a couple of new songs there. They were very rough, rugged days, but still very exciting. We were trying to create our own future by writing great songs.
I bet your mother and grandmother were beside themselves with excitement, were they?
Well, my mother couldn't believe it. My mother was very supportive. When I dropped out of high school, I didn't tell her that I was going to drop out of school. I just did it one day. And when she came home from work that night, she was pretty upset, but she always supported the fact that I was working already. And she thought, I'll give my son a chance to chase his dream.
So we get to about 1970 when you really hit it big internationally with the album American Woman.
Yeah. Well, we had been touring the States already on the strength of These Eyes and Laughing, which were both pretty big records. And we were doing a show back in Canada after touring the States for quite a bit. We went back in Canada and we were doing two shows. And between shows, I was outside. And this is the exact story of how it happened. I've read in, Randy tells one story, Jim Cale tells one story, and everybody's got their own story. I'm the guy that made it up, made the song up. So I'm telling you the truth.
Okay.
I was outside between shows. There was a guy that had some old Gene Vincent records. And I'm a huge Gene Vincent fan. Gene Vincent and the Blue Caps. They were some of the original bad boys of rock and roll. I was trying to strike up a deal to barter some of these records away from this kid. And I'm outside the curling rink, and all of a sudden I hear the guys had gone on without me, and Randy was just playing some riff. I said to this guy, listen, and we'll talk about the records later. I'm supposed to be on stage. I ran in, and Randy had, by this time, had Jim and Gary playing along with the riff. I walk up on stage, and this chugging is going on, and I'm thinking, wow, this is pretty cool. It's chugging right along. So I just started making stuff up. And more or less, I was just trying to make things rhyme. But here's what I was thinking. And this is where the line came from. American Woman, Stay Away From Me. We had been touring the States, and it always seemed to me, as a young guy, that the girls were trying to grow up faster in the States. They wore more makeup at a younger age. They were trying to dress a little more sensuously at a younger age. And after seeing this for a while in the States, then we came back to Canada, and it didn't seem to me like the girls were trying to grow up quite as fast. So guys are playing this riff, and I'm thinking to myself, Canadian Woman, I prefer you. But what came out of my mouth was, American Woman, Stay Away From Me. I was never thinking politically. There was no political inference to the song. But here's the thing. This was 1970. The Vietnam War was at a tremendously bad point of escalation. And when those lines came out, American Woman, Stay Away From Me, and then I was just trying to make things rhyme about, I don't need your war machines. I don't need your ghetto seeds. I was just trying to make things rhyme. Colored lights can hypnotize, sparkle someone else's eyes. Made all that up on stage in front of that crowd. And somehow we got a hold of a cassette tape of that jam later, and we decided to make a record out of it. It was totally ad-libbed. 90% of those lyrics I made up on stage in front of a crowd. And I always, to this day, I kind of think, yeah, that wasn't bad for one of those Bob Dylan stream of consciousness moments. Everybody thought I was angry and I hated the American girls. It's not true. No, I was never anti-American. It was just one of those hit records that got so big, we couldn't believe it. It was #1 in Billboard for 3 weeks.
Two things I want to ask you about that. All the touring that you were doing everywhere and seeing all these girls with their makeup on and their sensual clothes, does that suggest that you hadn't become hypnotized by the bright lights and the drugs and the sex and rock and roll?
I was always a little bit dazzled by show business. I was dazzled by the response we got in the Devrons. Before I was ever in the Guess Who, we had a fan club that treated us like the Beatles. One time, 3 or 4 of the girls came over to my mother's house and stole the bird bath out of the backyard. Another time, they came in the middle of the night with screwdrivers. We lived at 152 Bannerman. They unscrewed the numbers and took the 152. And I mean, this was Beatles kind of stuff. This was the stuff they would do at John Lennon's house in England. But I mean, this had translated to Winnipeg. They were magical times. They really were.
Well, you didn't answer my question though. Did you remain kind of more clean living than a lot of the rock and rollers that were out there on the road at the same time?
Well, I got that phone call from the Guess Who. I was still so young. I hadn't really thought about moving out yet. During that year and a half with the Guess Who, I mean, we traveled all over. So it wasn't as though I hadn't traveled. I did start traveling pretty young.
Burton Cummings, this show, A Breath of Fresh Air, I always reach out to listeners and ask them if there's somebody special that they'd like to hear from. You've been requested by a bass player, actually, a guy called Warren who lives in Kyneton here in Victoria. And I'd asked Warren, is there a special question that you'd like to ask Burton Cummings? And the one question he came back to me with was, being Canadian, how hard was it to break into the American scene in the first place?
Oh, listen, even to this day, Canadians have trouble breaking into the United States. There have been a whole slew of Canadian acts that have had tremendous success in Canada, but that success hasn't drifted across the border. For us, it was very, very difficult. We just kept getting knocked down and getting back up again. That's what it was.
Well, seems like getting knocked down and getting right back up again was definitely the way to go. The Guess Who soon became the first ever Canadian band to achieve a #1 single in the US. During their most successful period, the Guess Who released 11 studio albums, all of which reached the charts in Canada, Australia and the US. The band scored 14 top 40 hit singles, 2 of which made it to #1 in the States. It was at the height of their success that guitarist Randy Bachman decided to leave the group, and not long after this, the Guess Who called it quits.
Randy was at that point a devout Mormon, quite religious, and the other 3 of us were more party boys, you know. We were young guys in a rock and roll band, traveling around, not dopers, but certainly we liked to drink and stay up late and make noise. And Randy didn't want any of that. And it, you know, we had already finished another album to follow American Woman, and things were just so uncomfortable. We scrapped that album. To be honest, we moved on with Kurt and Greg, and we did Share the Land. And that became the biggest album ever for the Guess Who. Much bigger than American Woman had been. Share the Land became one of those songs that we would do it at pop festivals. It became like an anthem. Yeah. It was just, I didn't see that coming. I wrote it very fast. So there you go.
You disbanded in 1975. Why?
By that point, we had a guitarist named Dominic Troiano who leaned more towards jazz. He wasn't the same kind of musician. Like, we were all weaned on AM radio and 3-minute songs, and Troiano wanted to do all this fusion music. He almost resented the fact that he had to play the hit records. I don't think he liked the hit singles very much. After about a year and a half of that, I was very uncomfortable, and I thought, you know what, while I'm still not too old, I'm going to give it a shot as a solo artist. And that's what I did. And my first single went gold, Stand Tall. It was a huge record. I didn't see that coming, but I'm still very grateful to this day.
How confident were you going out as a soloist?
I wasn't confident at all. I was terrified. But I had seen our old friend Neil Young, who came from Winnipeg too. We all knew each other when we were teenagers. Neil Young had been with Buffalo Springfield, and they had tremendous success. And then the Buffalo Springfield broke up, and Neil went on his own. And I saw those first 2 solo albums of his, and I thought to myself, maybe a bit arrogantly, if Neil can do this, so can I. And I will tell you this, in all honesty, it's a lot harder than people think. The solo artist life, when things are great, you get all the accolades, yes. But when things aren't good, you take all the slush yourself. I was terrified at first, but between the first two solo albums, I got pretty quickly established as a solo guy. And I had a manager at the time who was managing Alice Cooper. He put me on tour with Alice Cooper, 20,000 people a night. It was a pretty quick way for me to reach a lot of people. I think you need luck. I'm not going to sit here and tell you I'm the greatest thing in the world, but I'm a fairly decent singer. The best thing that people tell me is you don't sound like anybody else. And that, I think, is something that every singer would love to hear.
Yeah.
But, I've never stopped trying.
You did have a short reunion tour with the classic Guess Who lineup in 83. Then you had a bit of an extended break from recording during that time. Then there was a tour from 2000 to 2003 where I
Yes.
think you played the largest outdoor ticketed event in Canadian history. No surprise. In 2006, you and Randy started a new duo project backed by the Canadian rock band The Carpet Frogs.
Mhm.
And you'd lost the use of the name The Guess Who at that stage, hadn't you?
Yeah, you hear about this all the time.
Yeah.
Steve Perry has trouble with the guys from Journey. John Fogerty went through hell. It's not an uncommon story, Sandy.
Yes, I realise
There
that.
is a fake band out there. None of the guys that were on the records, they call themselves the Guess Who. And I have to fight that, because some people think I'm still with the band and some people think that Bachman is still with the band. But whatever. I'm just grateful for what I have. And I don't spend as much time thinking about what I don't have.
Burton, which is your favourite Guess Who song? Which do you like to sing the best?
You know what? I am very partial to No Time. It was a harder song than Laughing or Undone or These Eyes. It's a pretty good rock and roll record. It's a true example of co-writing because Randy had that guitar riff. And then Randy started singing No Time Left for You. And I started singing over that, on my way to better things. And the next thing we knew, couldn't have been more than about an hour. And the song was finished. And I heard it the other day on the radio here in Canada. And I got to tell you, it still sounded good to me. It didn't sound as old as it is.
Yeah, there's something about all of those songs, isn't there, that they just have not dated, and they'll still be around for the next 50 or 100 years for future generations because they still sound so fresh. Just before I let you go, Burton Cummings, tell me about your poetry writing. You said that you're about to publish your second book of poetry.
Yes. I always wrote little limericks and silly poems in school, but I never really thought I would write a book of poetry until 3 or 4 years ago when the first one came out. I gathered up a bunch of poems I had written over a period of about 8 years. We put it out, and I got rave reviews from professors and English teachers and fans, particularly the people that have always loved my lyrics. They love the poetry. It's pretty serious stuff. It's not fluff. It's the old style poetry that we learned in school way, way back in the 1950s. It's a throwback to old style poetry.
The first one was called The Writings of B.L. Cummings. Is the second
And
one...
this is called the Writings of B.L. Cummings 2.
But these are not poems that can be set to music.
Some of it's blank verse, some of it's poetry, some of it is silly limerick, but it's all tailored to making the words dance. I try and make the words dance. I try and make the words stand up on their own. It's not like writing lyrics for a song. These things I write in the poetry books, they have to stand on their own in the mind, the silent mind of whoever's reading it.
A lot of people listening to this obviously can't see you unless they have a look at this interview on YouTube. But for somebody who is 76 years old, you really look 20 years younger. What's your secret there?
I don't know. That's a pretty big compliment. People do tell me all the time that I don't look my age.
You don't?
So, whatever that is, put it this way, Sandy, I haven't exactly lived the life of a Buddhist monk. I was in a rock and roll band for years, and sometimes I make a joke that I didn't even go to sleep till I was 40. You know, I crammed a lot in. Part of it might be I've been religious about vitamins since the 1970s. And I always take my vitamins, just a multivitamin and some vitamin E.
Yeah.
So maybe that's it. I'm pretty clean, and maybe that answers your question, you know?
Well, whatever it is, you're doing fabulously. Long may it continue, Burton Cummings.
Thank you very much, Sandy. It was a pleasure talking to you, and I hope people will find this enjoyable. And I do hope to be coming to Australia before too long.